Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the IIP's monthly webinar. My name is Rachel Marshall. I'm the Executive Director of the IIP, and we provide a national platform to bring together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to promote data-driven strategies, cutting-edge scholarship, and innovative thinking. The IIP champions criminal justice policies that advance community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. I'm really excited for today's discussion, which is about utilizing data to address racial disparities and mass incarceration in the criminal legal system. And I want to say for a long time, prosecutors were not exactly known for novel collection or use of data. And there are still a lot of barriers that I know we'll touch upon over the course of the discussion today to them doing so, especially given how tight we know resources are in many of your offices and other challenges in collecting and using data. But I want to acknowledge that the offices here today and the prosecutors here today, as well as the leaders who are here to share their expertise as well, have really been innovators and have been leaders in how to overcome obstacles and prioritize the improvement of data systems, which in turn improves our legal system more broadly. So I'm really excited to launch into today's discussion. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep the bios very, very short, but we'll put a link in the chat to longer bios. And excited to get started. I'm going to start with Alex Chohlas-Wood, who's an incoming assistant professor at NYU Steinhardt and the faculty co-director of the Computational Policy Lab. He investigates how computational approaches can improve public policy and applied collaborations with government agencies. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Steve Descano, who's the Commonwealth attorney for Fairfax, Virginia. Since taking office, Steve has undertaken a reform agenda aimed at mitigating racial and socioeconomic disparities and countering mass incarceration in Fairfax County's justice system while keeping our communities safe. Under his leadership, the Office of the Commonwealth's Attorney has stopped requesting cash bail, implemented a new sentencing policy to address mass incarceration, and restructured the office to produce accountability around reforms, among other initiatives. Next, I'm thrilled to introduce Mary Moriarty, who's the county attorney for Hennepin County, Minnesota. She was elected county attorney in 2022, where she manages a staff of over 500 people with an annual budget of $69 million. The county attorney sets policies and priorities for prosecuting criminal cases, oversees child protection and child support cases, and provides legal advice and representation to county government. And we're going to hear a lot about the innovative work that Mary is leading in her office. And next, I am excited to introduce Allison Pierre, who's a former prosecutor and the founder and CEO of Innovative Prosecution Consulting in partnership with American University and the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology. Allison is an innovator, and in 2021, she founded Innovative Prosecution Consulting because she wanted to use technology to spur reform with state prosecutor offices. And her data team is composed of data scientists from American University School of Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology. Welcome to all our panelists. I'm really excited to start our conversation. And Allison, I'm going to follow up on your bio, if I may, because I want to lay some foundation. And obviously, you've chosen to prioritize using data within prosecutors' offices to advance reform. Why is it important for the justice system to be informed by data?
Rachel, thank you for having me. And the reason is because to make transformational change, we need to use a data program. I'm really excited that we're talking about this today because we're the day after Juneteenth, and the timing of talking about racial justice and mass incarceration is really timely. It's meaningful. As we all know, Juneteenth represents the day where Union soldiers went into Galveston, Texas, and told African Americans that they were free 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. The legacy and pain of slavery has affected our entire country and also the criminal justice system. And arguably, communities of color, especially the African American community, has suffered a lot of unfair outcomes. But the important thing to remember is that today, prosecutors have the power, and if they have a data program, they have the tools to look at racial disparities, for instance, in plea offers or sentencing, bail. And also with the data program, the state prosecutor's office has the tool to be able to look at mass incarceration, for instance, a diversion programs, really trying to figure out how to scale it and make it more impactful. But the future, Rachel, of I think our entire industry, and certainly with prosecutor offices, is building data programs because that allows you to make real impact.
Yes, let's talk about that impact a little bit in the perspective of prosecutors. So County Attorney Moriarty, I want to turn to you. What do you see as the benefits of a prosecutor's office's understanding and utilizing data that it's collecting?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be here. This is a really exciting topic. So from my perspective, the criminal legal system is a complete mystery to community members. And I think because it's a mystery, people have a really hard time asking, is what you're doing working? And it's so nuanced and complex. I think it's critical for us to be transparent with data so that people can understand and they can point to something and say, well, you're doing this. What percentage of people are coming back, or how many people are you diverting, or all of these questions that we all know. And we have among the highest racial disparities in the country, actually, in Minnesota. I'm not sure how many people know that, but across the board on almost every measure. So it's really important to me, and I think our community, to be looking at the decisions that we make as prosecutors, given the fact that we do have these really high racial disparities, to try to figure out what we can do better. I think we also, we're trying to look at it from a staff well-being perspective as well. So caseloads, trying to figure out how to use data to get our staff to look at their caseloads. For instance, we have a culture here where many cases get set for trial. In one period of time, we had about 400 cases set for trial, and we tried 20 of them. And so how can we use data to convince our staff that all of these cases could have settled, not all of them, but some of them could have settled. So for me, it's about accountability. It's about addressing these issues that we all know exist, and giving our staff tools to be able to think differently about how to handle their caseloads as well.
Thank you. And I want to follow up on that and ask you, Commonwealth Attorney Descano, about, we'd heard about looking at caseloads and how data can have an influence there. How does it also have an influence in terms of the decisions that prosecutors can make within your office?
That's a great question, and I appreciate you asking it, Rachel. And like everybody else, I'm happy to be here because this really is, the next frontier of prosecution. I think using data in that the way that you mentioned, which is kind of as a management tool in many ways, is really, really important. I know a lot of the things that we capture data on are our decision making. I'm really interested in what when my people have discretion, what they're doing with it. And what we like to do, or what I like to do, is we built our data program where we collect that decision making, but then we train around it. So we have our policies, but we're really looking for not only adherence to policy, but what we're looking for is through the data to make sure that people are doing what we would expect them to do. So by using data, constantly talking about it, letting people know what we're tracking and following up on it, it actually has the impact of not just watching, but it sets culture and it pushes people in a certain direction. So for example, there's a very certain specific way that we like to handle people who have come in with drug possession charges. We like to look at we like to look at drug possession through a public health lens, knowing that we're not going to prosecute our way out of drug addiction. And what we're seeing, what we're able to do with the data is essentially get people to think in a certain way where they're not taking a punitive action, that they're actually trying to help this individual, because they know that we're tracking it and we're constantly talking about it in the office. We do very similar things with bond, with diversion. What we found is that when we track the decisions that people make in the office, it not only allows us to really steer the ship, but it sets up kind of informal pathways that people follow, and it's actually been a really great tool for culture building in a reform prosecutor's office.
So when you're collecting data, how much are you limited by other agencies that are involved in the justice system in terms of collecting that data and then being able to analyze it?
Well, for us, it is somewhat limiting, right? When we rely on other partners. For example, the best example that we have in terms of what the limits are we get our demographic information from the police and magistrates. And we're very interested in demographic and racial information, but right now in our county, our police and our magistrates and our court system, we have a high percentage of our people who come into the system who are classified as white, because we are still in the county systems are still classifying Latino and Hispanic individuals as white, right? So that's a limitation there. And that's one of the reasons why so much of the program that we've built is us collecting data on our own decisions, because we know that we can control that. And when we build a program around collecting that data, we have a lot more confidence in that data. There's more things that we can do with it. We still collect from other agencies, but if we were to rely solely on that, I think we would have a very limited data set on things that we care about. And the data set would be somewhat problematic because that data is not being collected for the uses that we're putting it towards.
Sure. Let me bring you in, Alex, if I could, to talk a little bit about how some of the data analytics are able to identify disparities in some of the decision making that we've been talking about within prosecutors' offices. And if you have any examples that you want to share, that I think would be helpful.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of potential here for data analysis and data in general to help prosecutors understand what's going on in their own offices and to change policy going forward. So an example I like to think about is from one of our collaborators, the Jackson County prosecutor in Missouri, which is home to Kansas City. So in 2020, prosecutor Jean Peters Baker was looking to reduce the jail population to minimize the impacts of COVID on folks who are in jail. And this was one of the first times that she actually decided to use data analysis to understand what was going on, where there might be opportunities to reduce the jail population and still maintain public safety. And so she looked through her caseload and started with the sort of biggest group of cases, which were drug cases. And what she realized was that a large number of these cases came through buy-bust enforcement in Kansas City through the Kansas City Police Department. And she realized that most of the folks who had been arrested and referred to her office on these charges, the vast majority of them never possessed a gun. Most of them didn't have any history of violent criminal activity. And often these cases really delayed in even being referred to her office, taking weeks or months to actually get to her office, which undermined the sort of idea that these were really important public safety cases, but they still, were coming into her office in large volume. And she also realized that the folks who were getting caught up in these charges were mostly Black. So it was something like 80% of the folks who were referred on these buy-bust cases were Black, compared to about 40% of her jurisdiction is composed of Black folks. So big disparities. For most cases, it seemed like there wasn't much public safety benefit to pursuing these cases. And all this information was something she found out through data analysis. So this was news to her. This is, I think quite shocking to her, in fact, to realize that this was going on. And so she set a policy that said that she generally was not going to charge these cases unless there was some clear evidence of either impacts on public safety or impacts on community well-being. And the sort of example that she gave is if there was a drug house with really heavy activity that was strongly impacting the community, then she might reconsider charging that specific case. But she instituted this policy, that promises to reduce racial disparities. And that was all really started from this single data analysis that she had her staff do to understand the sort of cases that were coming in the door. So I think it's just one really nice concrete example of a way that data can really tell you what's going on in your own office and then inform how you make decisions and set policy in the future.
Yeah, it's a very helpful example. Thank you. I want to follow up with you, Allison, on something that Mary mentioned earlier about the importance of data collection to advancing transparency within communities. And so when you work with prosecutors across the country, what ways do you see prosecutors' offices collecting data? And what methods are they using to be able to do that? And how are those methods, if at all, helping to really address mass incarceration in particular?
Well, the first step that we do is we serve as a technical research partner for prosecutor offices. And we launched with the Fairfax County Commonwealth Attorney's Office. A big part of the work is having a data team, which means I have a team of data scientists that have been working at Fairfax for about 3 years, 2 research professors and 2 research associates. And we work with the team's internal staff, data director, and the model is to work with a prosecutor's office case management system and help with the process of collecting the data, cleaning it, analyzing it, being a prosecutor's office resource to look at whatever they want. In Fairfax, we focused on bond reform, But the model is to go to any office with a data team and look at a particular policy that the prosecutor wants to focus on, the elected, as to reform. And that would relate to mass incarceration. Like, for instance, in the Cobb County District Attorney's Office, which is where we are also in Atlanta, we're looking at how to help really take a wonderful diversion program that District Attorney Flynn Brody put together and make it better, more impactful, basically. And those are the kinds of things that stem mass incarceration, because as we all know, diversion is the off-ramp for defendants from traditional prosecution. If the defendants are in compliance with a pretrial diversion program, their case can get dismissed. And that's how it's directly related to mass incarceration. But my hope for the future with our work and the work that we're all doing is to showcase that prosecutors can build a data program to make whatever reform they see fit in their jurisdiction.
Absolutely. We share that hope, I think. I want to turn to you, County Attorney Moriarty, because you mentioned transparency earlier, and your data dashboards that you have advanced are really a key part of that. How did you develop your data dashboards in terms of any feedback from the community or law enforcement? What sort of drove the way that you have been working on those?
So the dashboards here in the Hennepin County Attorney's Office went online in 2019. That was before I got here. They were put together by a data scientist. Right now they are updated nightly. We have a data specialist who does that. The platform we use is Power BI. And we have over 40 internal dashboards as well that our supervisors, our staff can look at to use in various ways. We have our own, and this, Allison, goes to what you were saying too. We have our own data management system called ProCase that was developed internally. So we have developers, programmers that work on that. And the nice thing about that is we can customize it, which is something I want to do in the future, because they're just simply things we can't get at. Right now, our data dashboard, my guess is most of the public has no idea it exists, but it has information about cases that come to us, what we're charging, what we're diverting, what's the disposition, what is the type of case, what are the demographics, and it's got various filters. So you can look at it by police department. We have about 38 different police entities, agencies here in Hennepin County. You can cut the data in a lot of different ways. What it doesn't do is really talk to you about decision points. I mean, I can look at it and I can see, oh, we have large racial disparities in our, and this isn't accurate, but in our diversion, or I can look at it that way, but I can't tell the why. And so that's something that we're going to continue to work on. What I can look at is I can see that, because we have dashboards on this, how many young people, juveniles, have been certified as adults. And we could, in Minnesota, transfer to the adult system. And we can see that that's gone steadily down since I came into office. So we can measure things like that. There are a lot of things that we can't measure, and I know we'll be talking about what the future of data looks like. And I could talk about that there.
Yes, we'll definitely be getting into that. I wanted to ask you, Commonwealth Attorney Descano, about the role of community and how your office collects data and how you use it, community input, to shape what you seek to collect.
Yeah, that's a great question, because we do use it, like I said, we use it a lot as a management tool, but we also look at our data as a way to have an ongoing conversation with our community. So the way that when we first started this program, we had what we called a Justice Advisory Council, which was a group of individuals from our county. We're a large, diverse county of 1.2 million people, right outside of DC. So we tried to build a fairly robust and representative group of people who would meet with us pretty regularly to have conversations about what they wanted to learn about the justice system. And that's really what it is. It's teaching, because as Mary said, a lot of people don't know what's going on. It's a black box. And people who watch Law and Order, they may think that they know what's going on, but the justice system isn't Law and Order. So it's through groups like that. We also go out, and I know I talk to my community a bunch about things that they're important to, are important to them. And what I feel like it's part of my job is to translate those conversations into, you know, what people are really trying to get at, what they want to know. And then we figure out a way to collect that data so that we can tell them a story. We're always, I don't want to say always, but when we're thinking about a transparency aspect of it, we're thinking backwards, because we don't want to just say, hey, here's some data tables, go figure it out. We're actually trying to tell discrete stories and answer discrete questions. So really for us, it's about being out in the community, translating what they want, what our people, what the community wants, what they're curious about, and then us working backwards as to how do we collect this data, what story are we trying to tell, and then we tell that story. We found that if we are able to talk and tell stories that are pretty discrete, that the community has reacted a lot better to that than what we did initially, which was just kind of throwing data tables out there and trying to explain it, but it was too overwhelming. So that's kind of how we interact with the community when it comes to taking in the data and then giving it back to them and answering their questions.
Yeah, I think it's really important because data and data systems can be, as you said, very overwhelming. And you talked about the community response. What about your office's response in terms of how do you get buy-in from not just line attorneys, but everyone in your office, paralegals, support staff, executives, to be able to ensure that they're using data dashboards? And are there tips that you have for other prosecutors on this call about buy-in?
Yes, it's something I think a lot about, and you know, a thing that we here have taken a lot of pride in. And what I like to think about is it's not about just saying, hey, we're going to do these data tables. It's actually about building a culture where data is important. You know, we've been doing this for a while now. We have the phrase data driven decisions is in our value statement, right? Like it is core to what we do. We ask for feedback from the members of our team as we're building this, where you're constantly asking for feedback, but we're also constantly talking to our office about it, right? We are showing them, we're talking to them about the data that we're collecting. When things aren't going the way that we want, we're very upfront and saying, hey, these numbers don't look, let's train around this. I know we had examples when we first started where people were misinterpreting our bond policy, for example. Right, and that data alerted us to that issue, and then we trained rigorously on it, and actually we're able to talk to the community about, look at how our numbers are improving based on the data that we got. And then honestly, Rachel, probably the most important thing, and I know this is probably the most uncomfortable thing for elected prosecutors, is if there are people in your office who do not buy into the vision and the values and the culture, you have to get rid of those people. This is the way that we look at it, is using the data, following the data, inputting the data. We've built our entire office structure and systems around there. And to us, not having your data in or ignoring your data, to me, is like you're ignoring your Brady or Giegler obligations. That's how seriously we take it. And of course, when you take that approach, there are bumps in the road, people leave. But what you have at the end is you have a very tight-knit office that has a culture of data, where if somebody came in and tried to take the data from my team now, that would probably be the revolt.
Rachel, can I
Yeah, of course,
jump
please.
in on the, yeah, it reminded me of when I came here, I was aware that the office had a point system. And the point system was actually built into our case management system, where prosecutors checked off a box. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's really important for people thinking about their data systems, or when they're building one. What are you incentivizing or not incentivizing? Because I became aware that this point system incentivized people to set cases for trial, to say that they were ready for trial, to get sent out for trial, to be in trial, because you got various points for that. And that is not something that I wanted to incentivize. I wanted to incentivize other things. And so we have been working on changing that. And I know it came from supervisors wanting information about caseloads. And by looking at the points, but there are various problems with that. If you're trying to look at someone's caseload and how effectively they're moving their caseload, You want to look at different data sets. It can't be everything that gets set for trial. And you take away cases from that person because we don't know why they have so many cases set for trial. So I just wanted to throw out there, it is important to look at what is in the data, what are the prosecutors looking at? Because I know we also get pushback when you do require prosecutors to spend their time clicking certain boxes or writing things in there because they're very busy. But what are the things we're asking them to do, and what does it say to them about what our priorities are?
Rachel, I actually wanted to add one thought. It's thinking about Commonwealth Descano's comments, especially changing the culture of a prosecutor's office is incredibly challenging because most prosecutors are thinking about how many trials they need to get done. That's mostly how they're evaluated. And I think what Commonwealth Attorney Descano did that was really unique is he made it a priority from the top all the way down through his administrative staff in meetings, showcasing that this was extremely important. And to your point of best practices for other offices, I do think that the change has to happen incrementally, and it can happen with positive incentives or a bit of other techniques that are necessary if there's someone that really isn't committed to data. But it is a dramatic change for lawyers to think about collecting data, looking at a dashboard. But if you make it a part of the culture over time, you can make the kind of changes that the Fairfax County Commonwealth Attorney has made. And it's transformational.
That's great. I want to turn us a little bit to what seems like it's a conversation that comes up in every topic, but around AI. And how, Alex, I'll turn to you. How do you see AI playing a role as we have this conversation around data, in how can AI influence prosecutorial practice around data decisions and other decisions within an office in the next few years?
Yeah, great question. I get this a lot and have certainly been thinking about this since everybody's talking about AI. I see really three main ways that AI is going to, influence prosecutorial practice generally. So the first kind of major change I expect is that the cases that come into prosecutor's office might change a little bit. And so I think the clearest example here are cases that involve something called deepfakes, where some kind of media is made up, to represent a person falsely, and then that's used in the sort of commission of a crime. And so the best example of this is cases where somebody fraudulently calls a family member pretending to be, their son or their family member and saying, "Hey, I'm captured somewhere. You need to pay a ransom to secure my release." And it turns out that it's incredibly easy to generate that audio very convincingly of your family member, as long as that audio is available online. And you really don't even need that much audio. You need something like a minute or two, which you can imagine easily getting from social media. You can go to one of these publicly available websites. It costs something like $1 or $5 to sign up for these things. You can generate any sort of amount of text once you upload the audio that sounds extremely convincing, like it's coming from the voice of somebody you know. And it's actually, already sort of fooled certain family members into thinking they're actually talking to their own family member, when in reality that person is safe and has no idea that this sort of ransom is going on. So I think that's one clear example of how AI might sort of influence the cases that come in the door. So that's one idea. Second sort of way I see AI influencing prosecutorial practice is just through the kinds of evidence that are generated on a case. So probably the best known example here is something called facial recognition, or automated facial recognition, which uses something like a photo of a suspect from the scene of a crime to connect with other databases of photos like driver's licenses or mugshots to try and come up with a list of potential suspects on a case. So this has been around for a few years, but certainly I think falls in the bucket of AI and sort of how new technology might influence practice. And I think, like a lot of algorithms in the criminal justice system, there are good reasons to be concerned about using this kind of technology effectively and fairly, and making sure that the algorithms themselves are also equitable and effective in sort of their job. Another sort of risk I see on the evidence front is that at some point, people will start knowing that it's easy to generate evidence, even if it's not real. So things like photos or videos, even in the next few years, might be very easy to generate convincing representations of the scene of a crime or something like that, even if it's not real. And so I think for prosecutors, starting to really underscore the sort of metadata or the authenticity of evidence is going to be a big issue going forward. Once people and juries start to understand that this evidence can, more or less be generated synthetically, and that you need to sort of be able to testify and demonstrate that the evidence that you've collected is actually real. So that's certainly one sort of kind of crazy threat to think about with AI. Generally thinking about how AI might influence evidence. And then there's sort of a third bucket, which I think is maybe the most relevant for this conversation, which is how AI might influence, actual practice for prosecutors. And so one place that I think is still a little bit premature, but case studies have started to come up, is thinking about using AI, things like ChatGPT, to write case documents or review case documents, review other kinds of media like photos or videos, audio even. So I know a lot of you deal with hours of jail calls, for example, and using some of these algorithms to sort of sift through large bodies of evidence and point out things that you might want to review more carefully. I think there's a lot of promise there to reduce workload and make your sort of work more efficient. Of course, again, with some big concerns on how those things work and whether they're effective in actually doing the sort of achieving the goals that we want. So that's sort of one area, and I think there are actually real sort of places where this is coming up, and the clearest example I've seen, which is new as of just a month or two ago, not from the prosecutor context, but for police departments, Axon just released this product a couple months ago. I'm not sure if you all have seen this, but basically what it does is if you have an Axon camera on your body, you're at the scene of an incident, that footage is getting uploaded to the cloud, and Axon has a program now called Draft One that is reviewing that footage in real time and coming up with a draft of the incident report for you to come back to your desk and then edit, after the sort of draft has already been created by AI. And so I think there's like pretty clear ways that that sort of paradigm might sort of work its way into prosecutorial practice as well. For example, again, to review large volumes of body camera evidence and maybe come up with a summary for you to review in much more timely fashion. Another project which I'll happy to talk about at some point is a project that I'm deeply involved with called race-blind charging, where we're using AI to automatically redact race-related information from police reports so that when prosecutors review a case for the first time, they can record a race-blind decision on the case. But happy to talk about that whenever it's most relevant.
Yeah, let's talk about that now, because I want to talk about how technology can be used to reduce racial disparities. And you just mentioned the algorithm that you used. I know you piloted it in places like San Francisco, Yolo County in California. Can you explain how do these algorithms work, and what are some of the findings that you found when you've used algorithms to redact race-related information from cases?
Yeah, so we have been working on this project for about 5 years now, my colleagues in the Computational Policy Lab, which I help lead. And so fundamentally what we do is we take in police reports that come in the door. We use AI to look through those documents, extract the text of the narrative, and then actually look through that narrative and look for any race-related information. So this could include things like obviously explicit mentions of race, but also things like names or neighborhood or addresses, which might, in some cases be a pretty good indicator as to somebody's race. So we look for all of these different kinds of things, physical descriptions as well, and we redact those and replace them with a sort of generic word that allows the prosecutor reviewing this report to still understand what was mentioned, but just not understand the actual race that was alluded to. And so the sort of process that we designed is that prosecutors look through this redacted narrative first, they record a race-blind decision on the case, and then immediately after, they can review other kinds of evidence that would be hard to redact, like photos or videos, and they can record a final race-aware decision on the case. And the sort of key there is that if their decision differs from the initial race-blind decision, they're just asked to explain why. And the sort of normal sort of situation here is that you might imagine if they review new evidence, it might either tip their decision in either direction because the strength of the evidence might be stronger or less strong than they expected at that initial stage. So there's good reasons for that decision to change, but we just ask that they consciously motivate that change in decision so that it's not a sort of unconscious decision that they're making, potentially based on somebody's race. So like you said, we did pilot this in both San Francisco and in Yolo counties. What we found in those two pilots is that it's pretty effective at making it hard to guess the defendant's race. So once you follow this process, it's actually, we have sort of been successful at removing most of that relevant information, but we don't yet actually know how it impacts charging decisions themselves. And so we're launching a large-scale randomized controlled trial over the next year to actually investigate and assess this impact on charging decisions, and in particular to see if it changes charging decisions by race, number one, and then to see if it has any sort of unexpected impacts. For example, whether it changes charging rates overall, which is not maybe something you'd expect from this intervention. So I will mention, you sort of another relevant piece here is that this idea is picking up steam. So the state of California actually adopted a law in 2022 mandating that all prosecutors across the state of California use race-blind charging by 2025, by the beginning of next year. So we're now working with a couple of the country's major software vendors for case management systems to integrate this algorithm in their software so that anybody could freely use this in this software and run this intervention in their own offices. So something that should be ready this year.
We'll definitely want to follow up on that. I want to, as we think about the future, think a little bit more about what are other ways that we can use data to address some of the disparities. And Allison, let me ask you, how do you see different data collection, whether it's demographics, as we've been talking about a little bit, program participation rates, recidivism rates, of course, other sort of measures, how should they be collected? And how do you think that they can improve, expand the expansion or the implementation of certain kinds of programs like diversion, which we were talking about a little bit earlier?
Sure. In terms of how they should be collected, that's where you do need, if you're a prosecutor's office, you need a technical research partner. It could be my team or another research university locally to help with the collection of the data. And it's also helpful if there is an internal team. With the Fairfax County Commonwealth Attorney's Office, they have a wonderful data director, and it made our job easier to help with the collection, cleaning, and analysis of their bond data. But as to diversion specifically, it's really important to have a data program. I've been saying that a few times, that a program isn't just putting up a dashboard or analyzing data. It's having a group of people internally and externally focused on one policy. And if that policy is bond or diversion, you really want to figure out what is the 4-year strategy to showcase to the community what you're going to do. And for instance, going back to our work with the Cobb County District Attorney's Office, the strategy there was to showcase that the office created a nonviolent felony diversion program that's working. And it's working because the recidivism rate is low. It's working because it's cheaper to go through diversion than traditional prosecution. So we're doing a cost-benefit analysis of that. But the whole message to the community is we are looking at the data to help make impact, and the impact is what the community asked, which was an alternative to jail, which was diversion. And that's the big picture, thinking of how prosecutor offices can communicate to their constituents how they're making reform, and then building that data program around their reform, so that this is the culture going forward for our whole industry and our whole profession as prosecutors.
Thank you for that. And I want to ask you, County Attorney Moriarty, how has your office used data specifically to improve any programs within the office? And if not yet, since I know you talked about a lot of these changes being very new, how would you anticipate doing so moving forward?
So we got a grant to do a gun diversion program. We handle felony drug cases. And they're gun possession cases with some kind of predicate offense that makes it a felony. And unfortunately, it's a 5-year mandatory minimum. And so, and the data shows that it's a high percentage of Black men in the ages of 18 to 28. And so we made this proposal, this grant proposal, so that we could do a diversion program in the hopes of showing that those racial disparities would go down. I mentioned earlier that the data dashboards we have will tell us a lot of information about charging, the fact that we have charged, the fact or what happened in terms of the disposition. We also have the Minnesota State Sentencing Guidelines that has a lot of data as well. So you can see how many departures from the guidelines there were. You can see racial disparities there, but what you can't see is the why. So what we're trying to look at are the decision points. Allison, you've talked about that a little bit. and Alex, you have too. It's the, why are we making the decision? We know, we can look at our office and we know that we offer departures for more white defendants than Black defendants. But why is that? And right now our data doesn't tell us that. So we're working with a number of organizations to try to figure out, how do we get at those decision points? Because I think that's where the critical information will come out. In other words, to give an example, I'm very interested in traffic stops. And one of the things police say is, we get all kinds of weapons from traffic stops. And when you look at the data, most dashboards will tell you that there are huge racial disparities in the number of, or the drivers that are stopped. But what they don't tell you is how often when Black drivers are stopped is law enforcement getting a gun. And we were able to get that data and crunch it here in Minneapolis. And we realized that the data said, when Black drivers are stopped and searched, police find a gun in less than 0.5% of the cases. So that's really compelling data. You know, I think you look at any dashboard, any law enforcement, and you can see huge racial disparities, but the narrative around that is, oh, we're getting guns and drugs. So if you could actually use data to show that this is an ineffective use of resources, that's much more compelling, a much more compelling narrative to tell community and police as well. So what I'm hoping to do is to expand or create our ability to do that. Also, I think, you know, we applied for a grant to get some opioid money from the opioid settlements, so that we could get fund another social worker for a diversion program. And I was asking about the data. What kind of data do we get from diversion? And it's typically, does somebody make it through? Is there recidivism? That kind of thing. But I asked, you know, if we're trying to approach this from harm reduction, those don't seem to be the right decision points to me. We should be collecting different kinds of data. So if we're really trying to tell the narrative of how effective we're being, I think we have to be looking at what are our measurements? You know, not just does somebody pass, you know, make it through the year. So those are some of the things that we're working on.
Yeah, and I want to mention, for those who are interested, we did a webinar last month, and we'll put the link in the chat, around non-public safety traffic stops with your colleague John Choi was on that session. So a lot more information in that session for those who are interested. But I want to follow up on that thread that you brought up around law enforcement and how, and I want to bring Commonwealth Attorney Descano as well into this question, but how are the data that you collect shared with law enforcement or other stakeholders, whether judges or defenders or anyone else in the legal system? And do you see an impact on any other partners' behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Oh,
and
sorry.
I will tell you my my answer is probably one part going to make you happy and then one part probably going to make you sad. And the part that's going to make that we do share our data with a lot of the other stakeholders. A great example is what we did with bonds, where when we initially got into this, we saw that in certain categories of different types of charges, you know, we would be recommending release 70% of the time, and some of the judges would be holding people 70% of the time, right? So when you actually when you're sharing this information, though, what we saw over a year roughly period is that the decision making of the judges came more in line with our decision making. And you know, ours moved a little bit as well, but when things were transparent and when we were able to break things down by case type, even by judge, even by prosecutor, it gave people an opportunity to say like, oh my goodness, you know, I might be the outlier here. Let me kind of re-examine kind of what I'm doing, right? So I thought that was really, really helpful. Also within the courthouse system, you know, we've been able to identify just through data some efficiencies that we could find, different ways that our agency and other agencies within the courthouse can kind of work a little bit more together more seamlessly. And that's been really, really helpful. The part of my answer that is probably going to make you less happy is I don't necessarily know how realistic that is to happen with other stakeholders outside of the court system itself. most predominantly police. I think it's really, really interesting, you know, having done this for a while now. A lot of people on the outside may not recognize that even within a legal system, every actor has their own incentives. Every actor has people that they answer to. And data in our agency that might mean something to us may not mean anything to another agency. I mean, you can see a world in which and remember, we're talking about law enforcement here, we're talking about public safety, but because we're elected, a lot of people are elected, this in many ways is a political enterprise. You can see a scenario where you have a prosecutor who is a reform-minded prosecutor who has made promises to the community. I want to get at racial disparities. I want to do these things. I want to build diversion programs. Living in the same community where maybe there's a very strong police union, and the board of supervisors who oversees the police, what their incentives are, because they haven't made these promises. They just don't want beef from the police union, right? They don't want to get on TV with their officers saying that, you know, things are different. So or that things are bad because we're doing these other things or what have you. So even in that scenario, you have a bunch of agencies with different incentives, who may or may not be keying in on the same data as important. So that's just a long way around saying, while it is possible to use data that we collect to change the system and other actors around us, I think that everybody who's involved in this work should really go into it with their eyes open that, you know, data alone isn't a thing that is going to have another agency turn on a dime, right? Because maybe they don't believe it, or maybe they don't want to believe it, or their incentives are different. So it's possible. It's something that definitely can be done. But I think the idea that, you know, a prosecutor's office is going to collect a certain amount of data, and that alone by itself is going to have an immediate and noticeable difference on the way, you know, the community in that same county or that same city, I think is a little unrealistic. It can be done, but it's not going to happen overnight.
County Attorney Moriarty, did you want to jump in on that too?
I did. We found using data to be a somewhat effective way of counteracting the narratives that police put out there. And I'm pretty sure you've all heard, you all have your own revolving doors, and we as prosecutors are not holding people accountable. And I heard that narrative. I've been in office about 1.5 years now, and I heard that narrative a lot. And one of the ways we were able to start shifting that is by looking at clearance rates. We looked at clearance rates for auto theft because that was one of the few crimes that was really going up here as it was in other places. And it turned out that the clearance rates, meaning how many cases or what percentage of cases did we actually get from law enforcement on auto theft, is about 2%. And there were over 7,000 cars stolen in Minneapolis. And so I went to a Minneapolis City Council meeting to talk about our youth auto initiative. But one of the things I said to them was, because of the clearance rates being 2%, we can only hold people accountable if we're actually getting the cases from law enforcement. And then I went on to talk about our youth auto initiative. The interesting thing about it is that law enforcement was not happy about it at all, because when you actually use data to show what's happening out there, it doesn't look good for law enforcement typically, because the clearance rates are very low. But when you're using it to tell a narrative, a story, it's been pretty effective. And I knew it was effective because there's a woman on social media, some crime watch kind of organization. She does not like police or us at all. And she describes Minneapolis as being a hellhole, that kind of thing. But I knew we were making some inroads when she wrote, well, the police say they've arrested 15 people on such and such, but the true issue is how many have they actually submitted to the county attorney's office for charging. And so I thought, okay, we're starting to change the narrative here. So the focus is not on this revolving door and we never hold anybody accountable. And so I do know law enforcement is very sensitive about that data, but the data is there. And I think we can effectively use that in ways that counter that narrative. I mentioned our youth auto initiative because the way I was able to kind of combine the clearance rates was to say, because we know that clearance rates are really low for many, many reasons. And we knew from police that even though they couldn't bring us a chargeable case, they knew who the young people were who were at risk. And so we created an entirely different pathway that they could give us information, the names at least. And then we created a whole new pathway. And we have a data dashboard on this, by the way, an internal one, where we would have a social worker reach out to the young people who weren't getting services from the county at all. And we have 1 year's worth of data on it, and we're about to talk about this next week. But 81% of those young people to whom we reached out and whose families accepted services have not come back to the attention of our office or law enforcement. That's amazing. But that was part of the whole narrative. That was, we built this out of the understanding that clearance rates are really low. So it was our narrative there, but it also did put out there the data that led us to partner with law enforcement to try to find a different pathway.
I want to jump into just listening to County Attorney Moriarty and Commonwealth Attorney Descano. I think a real challenge for most offices is figuring out how to release data without hesitancy, how to get buy-in from Attorney General, stakeholders like police departments, state legislature. There's so much pushback now on reform prosecutors. I think that there is a bit of a hesitancy to even trust how to talk about data in a way that you can trust it won't be used against you. And that's something that I know Commonwealth Attorney Descano can speak on, but I want to raise that point.
Yeah, I will say that is absolutely right. And Mary, what you said is absolutely correct. You know, I know we've done a couple of discrete things with the police department as well, where we've built programs that we're collecting data on, and that we want to, because we've our interest aligned on working together. For example, we have a thing called Operation Press Check, which is a gun initiative that we've gotten a lot of press on, and that's a great collaboration where we're collecting data, we're using data for purposes of training, we're using data to track outcomes, and we're going to talk to the community about that in a certain way. Because talking to the community in a certain way, as Allison said, is really, really important. And I think that you can't be afraid to put data out. I know for example, because once you put it out, that's not the end of it, right? And if you can communicate that to the public, that's really important. I know that when we first put our bond data out, there were some pieces of our bond data that I was not happy where the data was. But when we put it out, as part of putting it out, we made a promise to the community, we're going to train on this. We're going to train on this, and then in 6 months, we're going to come back to you with new data and show where we went. And we were able to train effectively, and the numbers reflected more what I think our community expected from us. And being able to go through that process was really, really helpful, because it built goodwill with us, with the community. They knew that we would release all data, not just that looked great for us, but we would be really, really honest about it. And then we also got, I think more importantly, got to prove the point of this is why data collection is important. If we actually collect data and use it, we can effectively use it to build better things in our system and get to better outcomes. So the more and more you do that, I think the more goodwill you buy, not only with the public, but with other actors who want to then start engaging with you. And I think that's where hopefully you maybe, after doing that for a while, you get the kind of a snowball effect where data becomes more and more important, not only to your agency and the public, but to the others that you work with as well. And that's all just having the courage to put it out.
Yeah, and Allison, I think that's a really good question, and one we've been struggling with a little bit. When I went and gave that presentation on the clearance rates, the police chief, the sheriff did interviews, and it was, oh my God, you know, it was interesting because we, and I'm sure this is true for many prosecutors' offices, have been the recipient of various things are our fault. And most of them aren't, but that's the narrative. And then when I went to the city council and I even tried to say, I'm not here to point fingers, here are the low clearance rates, and they're low for specific reasons. Kids are wearing masks, blah, 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 blah. But then the narrative became, I'm blaming everybody else, which was never the narrative when everybody else is blaming us. We've done some really good work, I think, with individual police departments with our data. We had a meeting once where we gave the mayors of various cities their own packets about clearance rates for their own city, the number of cases they've submitted to us. I went to a city council meeting once where there's always this, I'm hearing from my community that you're not charging drug cases or something like that. And then we went and looked it up and they submitted 9 drug cases to us and we charged 8. It's something like that. So we did individual packets for each mayor to have their own data. And we didn't share that with the other cities. And so I think that was effective in kind of debunking that kind of thing. And we do that with individual police departments and police chiefs. But anytime we put something out publicly, it becomes, well, you're blaming police. And it's in this culture right now, and I don't know how much it is in other places, but in Minneapolis, what we hear a lot is there's a war on law enforcement now, and the pendulum is completely swung away from what everybody was saying after the murder of George Floyd. And so it's kind of a touchy area to figure out, well, what can we put out and how can we do this? One of the ways about police, and one of the ways we tried to do that is with video. So using a narrative. There was a series of robberies, carjackings that happened over a weekend, 2 days. And the police chief said they knew exactly who these juveniles were and the revolving door and all of that. I get into work on Monday and I have this email. I heard the chief say that they know who these juveniles are. Why are you letting them out? And I thought, oh, you're assuming that they actually submitted cases to us. So we did a video where we said, hey, we wanted to talk to the community about this rash of carjackings and robberies that happened. Here's what actually happened. And we haven't turned out we hadn't received any of the cases there. And we talked about the fact that law enforcement can arrest somebody, but that doesn't mean they submit a case to us. And so I get what we've tried to do is use narrative, use video to put out, what's actually happening in the context of the system. It still gets pushback. And Steve, maybe you're more courageous than I am in just putting it out there. But it really is trying to walk this careful line of we're telling a narrative that it's explaining things to community, knowing that we're going to get a ton of pushback anytime it looks like there's any criticism of law enforcement, even if it's just facts.
Yeah, Mary, I wouldn't say I'm more courageous. I just think my self-preservation mechanism hasn't kicked in yet. But what you said is, and I don't mean that, Rachel, I don't mean to take over, I'm sorry, but I just want to piggyback on 2 things that Mary said, because you really did a great job of connecting to a thing you said very early to what you just said, which is our system really is a mystery to people. And if they only hear from us when we're responding to criticism, which we're going to get, right? Especially if we're reformers, every problem is our fault, and problems that haven't been found yet it exist because we hit them so well. But if they only hear from us when we're in defensive mode, we're not going to be effective. But having the data it gives us an opportunity to educate our community as to how the system works. And the more that we do that, the more we're in many ways trying to create a more nuanced consumer of the news when it comes to public safety, right? And that is not only for preservation of the work that we're trying to do, but I also think that it has a really great civic aspect as well. And because the more people in a community that actually have a nuanced view of public safety, law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, all those things, through the political mechanism, I think those communities will eventually see more nuanced and nimble judges, prosecutors, and police to match that. So I think that's another, Mary, what you said is 100% correct. It's super important for debunking and not only getting our narrative out, but actually teaching people how the system works.
That's really helpful. And I think it's been helpful to talk about some of the challenges in sharing data. I also want to talk about some of the challenges specifically in how data can sometimes create challenges around equity issues. So I wanted to start off with you, Alex, in terms of thinking about some of the algorithmic processes that you described earlier. I think there are some legal scholars that would argue that there are real concerns about fairness and equity when using algorithms. What are some of those concerns that you've heard, and how do you think prosecutors can respond to ensure that their use of data isn't creating more inequity, when obviously the purpose of our discussion today is how data can be used to reduce disparities?
Yeah, great question. So the sort of application that I return to when I think about this question is these things called risk assessment instruments or risk assessment tools, which generally are a class of like statistical tools that help people understand somebody's risk. So in the criminal justice context, often they're used to predict a defendant's risk, for example, when they're being considered for bail. And this is risk of something like failure to appear in court or risk of future criminal activity. And the sort of way that they generally work is they look at historical data, a lot of historical data about outcomes for people in the past. And then when you consider somebody, you say, what happened to similarly situated people in the past? Did they reoffend or did they fail to appear? And that gives you some sort of prediction about what that person is going to do in the future. So, on one hand, I think there's at least, a few years ago, there was a lot of hope for these tools that they could sort of bring in some benefits to the criminal justice system. One would be consistency in decision making. So between judges, for example, who are considering bail decisions, there's been research showing that these judicial decisions can be highly varied themselves. So depending on which judge you get assigned to, some judges might, release everybody or almost everybody. Some might release half of people. And I think that sort of inconsistency, just based on which judge you're assigned to, is not necessarily the kind of consistent justice experience that I think we want to see. So that's like one promise that a lot of people saw from these tools. Another was this idea of transparency, and that it could be a very explicit way for jurisdictions to talk about what they consider to be risky behavior, and it might allow people to understand how those decisions are being made much more clearly than just looking at judicial decisions or not really understanding how a judge is going to come to a decision. So I think there were some hopes that these tools would improve behavior, but then also over time I think people started to become aware of some potential concerns with these tools as well. So I think the biggest one is understanding what it means to learn from past behavior and past data in particular. So the clearest example here is if you can imagine a risk assessment instrument learning from historical drug convictions that might learn to replicate behavior of enforcement in the past that has been disparately applied by race group. So there's been studies that show that marijuana possession conviction, for example, is unevenly applied between Black and white race groups, even though usage rates based on other surveys have found to be roughly equal. And so you can imagine if an algorithm is learning from that past data that was a result of these sort of disparate processes, it might learn to predict that for future defendants in a disparate way. So that's one major concern that's come up. Other concerns have really focused on how the algorithm itself operates and whether the algorithm itself, sort of in a self-contained box, whether that's fair or not. And there's been a ton of research in that direction. But in my own work, I sort of take a step back and think about some of the bigger questions here. So one really, I think, useful question with these tools and with a lot of other data approaches is really how does it end up affecting your decisions as prosecutors? So putting aside how the algorithm itself operates, I think there's a real fundamental question about how it actually influences your decisions. And that's not something that we can really understand until we put something into practice and test out and see how it actually changes decisions or not. And so a concrete sort of way of thinking about this, it's a sort of coarse way of thinking about it, but I think it's useful to think through, is on one hand, you could imagine a risk assessment that scientists have looked at and validated as perfectly fair across race groups. But let's imagine that it's actually selectively used in practice to increase enforcement or increase incarceration against Black folks, but not against white folks. So this would be a situation in which the algorithm itself is perfectly fair, so to speak, but the way it's used in practice actually engenders disparate behavior. And I think that's definitely a possibility. And actually, there's been some recent research from an academic named Diag Davenport that showed that there's a risk assessment in New Jersey that was used in some version of this way, where it was sort of consulted at different rates based on the race of the person arrested. So real sort of questions there about how these things are used in practice that I think are much more useful from a policy perspective to understand if we are actually achieving the goals that we want to achieve. A second question with these risk assessments, and again, I think useful for us thinking through how to use data in general, is really, is this the sort of question we want to be asking itself? So for risk, the sort of way it's set up is, if I have this person, I'm going to guess that in the future they'll sort of reoffend at this rate, and I either put them in jail because they're high risk, or I release them because they're low risk. But I think there's a lot of different opportunities or options that we have available to us, that prosecutors have available, that might sort of change that calculus, right? And so for one example is failure to appear in court. You might imagine getting somebody coming in front of you and it looks like they're high risk for failing to appear. So that might suggest that you should set high bail so that they guarantee appearance in court. But in fact, you might be able to take other approaches, like sending just a text message reminder that costs a few cents per court date, that might dramatically increase the chances they appear in court without having to resort to this use of incarceration, which comes with really high costs. So I think there's a sort of fundamental issue with just thinking about risk without thinking about alternate ways that you can address risk. And another sort of example here might be the use of diversion programs, where again you have somebody like high risk juvenile, maybe a CA Moriarty in your case, sort of inherently high risk, but maybe you have other options available to you that you can use diversion or other interventions that reduce that risk without sort of resulting to practice as normal. And then, finally, I'll say, I think that just generally the sort of goal here, I think, with using technology and data is really that it should be oriented or addressing the real sort of fundamental policy goals that we want to address. And so I think a lot of the concern around risk assessments often has to do with people being uncomfortable with the idea of pretrial detention itself. And that sort of got wrapped up in the focus on pretrial risk assessments, because that directly addressed this question about whether we should be detaining people pretrial. But I think there's larger normative questions about whether that's, what the right rate of pretrial detention is, that are independent of the use of technology, but are really important questions for us to think about as policymakers in sort of these kinds of decisions. So lots of sort of larger context questions to consider when thinking through some of these tools.
Thank you for that. And Allison, let me ask you about some of these dangers, because obviously there's the goal of using data is to help minimize human error and bias, but are there dangers in over-relying on data and limiting the valuable role that prosecutors have by being human and their unique decision-making power? How does prosecutorial discretion play a role in using data?
I think prosecutors can use their discretion, their judgment, and have a data program simultaneously. They can be a balance. When you're a prosecutor and you go into court and you have your case, you need to look at the facts of the case, who's on the bench, the defense attorney assigned, the evidence that you're going to have to prove each element beyond reasonable doubt. And that's the judgment of the individual prosecutor. That has to stay. That's critical. But a data program just allows for consistency and fairness in the broad scheme of what the whole office is doing, to make sure there's some adherence to the policy that the elected sets. And it's important to know that you still can have discretion as a prosecutor. We're just adding on a tool, which is a data program, to make sure that the outcome for all defendants is fair.
That's really helpful. I want to sort of wrap up before we turn to questions from the audience, because I know we have a few, and ask every one of you, what do you see as the needs for future data collection, and sort of what would your dream system be? And also, if you want to add any advice that you might have for prosecutors who seek to use data. So it's a lot of questions, but I'll let each of you sort of take which piece you want, because I want to give you each a chance to sort of give some last words. And why don't I start with you, Mary?
That's a great number of questions that are exciting. I would say, don't just have a data dashboard to have a data dashboard. I think put a lot of thought into what do you actually want to measure. And for me, it's really, and I talked about this a little bit, it's the decision points. It's, and this is a tough thing. We're kind of embarking on this now. And we did spend a lot of time creating a strategic framework, which I think is important, because I think you ought to be referring back to that strategic framework, your mission, vision, and values. to figure out what it is that you're trying to do in the office. And one of the things we talk to people about is problem solving. The office in the past had all kinds of guidelines about you can't do this, you can't do that. We're trying to get people to look at the individual case in front of them and figure out what problem they're trying to solve. And so, you know, how do you define fair? How do you define all of those things? But I really do want us to look at those decision points. When we make the decision to offer a departure, why are we doing that? When we're asking for a certain amount of bail, why are we doing that? So there are all these decision points that our data at the moment isn't really getting at. The other thing is to think about, it sits on, I mean, as I said, most people know nothing about our data dashboard. I go do community events. You have to get out there and you have to talk about it in narrative form too. And one of the things we've done, we have our own YouTube channel, Hennepin County Attorney YouTube. We have a lot of explainers on there. We did a series called No Fear or Favor, which is a legislative series which uses data in there. And so I would say be thinking about, how am I going to use this and to tell the narrative? What is the narrative I want to tell? Because it's just critical to have that narrative, not just put data out there, because it's really hard. And as an example, I'm part of, as you probably all are, a criminal justice coordinating committee, and they wanted to put out a one-page data sheet every 2 months. And here's what it looks like. And you can't see it very well, but on the top, it's what's the population of the adult detention center, the juvenile detention center? And then it's kind of like, what are the clearance rates and what are the charging decision rates and all of that? And one of the biggest discussions we had with the court people that wanted to do this was, we want this to tell more of a narrative, because there's a lot that happens, especially with a juvenile who's coming into the system. And essentially what they said was, well, that's too much to put on one slide. And so it can be very difficult. But I think really thinking about what it is you want to measure, how is it related to your strategic plan, and how are you going to communicate that in the most effective way? I think those are the things that I think about a lot, and that continue to be challenges for us, especially when you have traditional media who doesn't have interest in putting that narrative out there. They want to talk about other things. So I think all of those things are really important to think about.
Thank you. Allison, let me ask you, I know it's a lot of questions at once, but wanted to give you an opportunity to respond.
Sure. I've been thinking a lot about where we've come as a country since the Black Lives Matter protests and George Floyd's killing. And I think that there has been a bit of a chilling, so to speak, in the commitment to racial justice and stemming mass incarceration. And now is the time, especially this is the day after Juneteenth, to recommit as prosecutors to say, what are we going to do to make impact? And what we're going to do, I think, is embrace a new strategy, use data and technology, build a data program in your office to make impact. And I know that there's 2 offices that have done this, and miraculously, they've done an incredible job. The Commonwealth Attorney's Office here, Stephen Descano, and County Attorney Moriarty are both models that it can be done within a few years. What I would ask everyone on this webinar is, if you're interested in a data program, talk about it to your supervisor, to your elected in your office, because I believe that technology is the way to make impact. And it's also the future of what's, I think, going to happen with our profession as prosecutors.
Thank you. Alex, I'll let you respond.
Yeah, I agree with all the points so far. I think one thing I'll add is, and something I've come to respect more and more over time, I think, is that the importance of evaluation on all of these efforts. So I think as reformed prosecutors, we have a lot of, exciting ideas about how to make the criminal justice system better. And a lot of them make sense and are intuitive, that we think they would achieve the sort of outcomes that we want. But I just underscore the importance of actually following that up with data and making sure that we are actually achieving the outcomes we want to see. And if we're not, that's an opportunity to adjust and then try again. So I think there's a way in which, aside from data and evaluation informing what decisions we make as an office or policies we set forward. They can also help us improve our policies and make sure they're achieving the actual outcomes we want to see. And I think that's a super important thing, especially for the sake of communication and transparency to constituents, is to be able to demonstrate that we are actually making the system better and achieving these sort of new outcomes that we weren't before. So I just underscoring the importance of evaluation over everything else.
Commonwealth Attorney Descano.
I would think, I would want everybody to remember that data is not just a transparency tool. It's a management tool. It can be integrated in the policy. And I think the most important question, and Mary mentioned this, is to ask why. Why are we, not only what is the decision, but why is the decision that we're making? I think that's the next frontier when it comes to data. And I also think it's really, really important to recognize that the design of your data collection itself can actually influence the outcome and policy adherence. I've mentioned a couple of times that when we first started looking at our bond policy, our bond data, that there were some areas that were not where we had hoped. At that time, we started to collect why people made certain decisions, because they had a gun, because they had this, but we had one box that was just other dangerousness. And when we took a look at our holds, we saw a huge percentage of prosecutors were selecting that as the reason why they recommended a hold. So that's crazy, right? We're trying to force people to tell us to make a decision, to think. We took that away. We took that option away, which essentially, on top of the training that we did, forced prosecutors to actually think harder and say, this is the reason why I think this person should be held. Because that's our policy. For a lot of things, it's a presumption that they're released unless you have a specific reason. And what we found is when we changed the design of the data collection, our numbers started to change, because that's kind of like a backdoor tool to orient people every time they make a decision. So what I would say is that what we should be thinking, the next frontier, and what every prosecutor should be thinking of, is how are they going to integrate, not just having data, how do we make that not a standalone thing that's integrated not only with transparency, but with management day-to-day, as well as policy adherence in the office. I think we can do that. That's when we'll get really successful with data programs.
They're great points from all of you. And we're going to briefly take a couple of questions. I know there was one question asking for a walkthrough of the Minneapolis data dashboard, and we don't have time to unfortunately do that, but happy to follow up and be helpful there. But one question was, what other metrics besides recidivism are any of you tracking as a measure of success?
We have a couple. So for example, I mentioned that we have a lot of discrete dashboards for discrete projects. One of the things that we're really proud of is that in Virginia, we're the leaders when it comes to red flag laws. The ability to get guns out of people's hands if they're in danger themselves or others. We're the only prosecutor's office in the state that has a special team set up. And the way our law works is you have your emergency order that can last for 14 days, and then you have to go to a court hearing where it can be extended out for 6 months. When we took a look at the data, we saw that too many, for various reasons that had to do with process, too many cases for my liking were not becoming the 6 months after the emergency 14 days. So tracking that and making sure that all of the cases that still represented the danger after 14 days got turned into those 6 month red flag law, that became a data point for us that was a measure of success, right? And that's different than recidivism, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to our bond policy, we have our things broken up by category. We know where, for example, nonviolent felonies, nonviolent misdemeanors, roughly where those should be with release recommendations. So that's how we measure success there. And then, of course, with our diversion programs, we track every individual prosecutor to see how often they're recommending people to various diversion programs, because we want to use those to the maximum. So those are just 3 examples of things that are important to us internally because they're important to our community, that we use data that is not just recidivism when it comes to whether we're succeeding or failing.
We were successful in getting an OJJDP grant for YPD, or youth prosecution, and we are writing an RFP for providers for our youth diversion program. And I'm looking at this because it's really new. What we want to do when we look at youth diversion, sometimes it's the same. What was the recidivism rate, that kind of thing. But we want to get at the cases, the types of programming the young person received and community served and other information to get at more information beyond just what type of case it was. And we're also looking at, and I mentioned this with our diversion program, especially when we're talking about substance use disorder, rather than does this person come back on a new case, there are many other things we could measure that are more related to harm reduction. And we know harm reduction is the best approach when we're talking about substance use. So those are just some of the other areas we're starting to do and to look into.
Thank you. Quick question for you, Alex. We had a question asking you to share the name of your race-blind prosecution project and software, and or anything that someone who is not involved might be able to follow your progress in the RCT, either during or after study conclusion.
That's a great question. So we've just been calling it race-blind charging. That is, now sort of also the name of the bill that California passed. So I think there's a chance that will get subsumed in some sense. But we are actually working with a really cool organization called Unlock Labs, which is a nonprofit out of Missouri that provides work experience to folks coming out of prison and specifically helps them build tech experience so that they can launch careers in tech. They're building a project website for us, which I hope to be done this summer, and that should be ready, by the end of the summer as a resource for folks who want to follow the project and get updates and sort of see where our research is at. So that's not ready yet, but I hope it will be soon. Feel free to reach out to me directly if you want a sort of update when that site is ready.
Thank you. Got some new questions coming in, so I'll try to keep the answers short if everyone can so we can get to them. One question regarding the problem with people being unaware of the data that's available. Are there best practices about how to reach out to impacted and stakeholder communities to ensure that the data offerings meet their needs, also that the metrics are meaningful to the impacted communities? Anyone is free to answer.
I'll jump in very quickly. I think the key is having a communication strategy to really reach out to not just criminal justice experts and lawyers and others who are going to look at a dashboard, but for impacted communities, you need to have a way of outreach, a human face talking to them about what the state prosecutor office is doing and how they are changing things. And I think this is a great question for County Attorney Moriarty and Commonwealth Attorney Descano as well.
Yeah, we do a lot of town halls. We do community meetings. We get together with our leaders of our community organizations. So, but it still is a tough thing to think about. How do you, we can tell about a specific thing that we're doing that nobody knew about, but for instance, I was at a number of Juneteenth events over the weekend, and I was talking to a religious leader from a major church, and I was talking about our youth auto initiative, and he said, "Why haven't I ever heard of it?" That's the continued problem. It's what is the communications plan? How do we actually, nobody has the time to sit down and look at a dashboard. So how are we communicating what we're doing? And I now believe, based on my year and a half, that is one of the most critical things. How do we get our message out there because we know the data, we know what we're doing works, hopefully. And if it isn't working, Alex, as you said, we need to switch course. We have to do something else. We want to be effective. But there's so many things that we're doing that are successful and are working. And there's so many forces out there that don't want people to know about that, including, I think, some major media markets. So what is our communications plan? How are we going to do that outreach to community?
That ties in really well to the next question, which I'll turn to you, Commonwealth Attorney. How can prosecutors or you can add on to what Mary was just talking about, and also how can prosecutors or advocates for reform effectively communicate complex data findings to the public to foster understanding and support for data-driven reforms?
Oh, you saved the easy one for me, Rachel. I appreciate that. But no, that's a very good question, and it does kind of tie into what Mary was talking about before. It is about just getting out there and talking to a bunch of people. I think that having that social media presence as well, where you're talking about other things and you're weaving this in, is really important. I think kind of to that specific question, it also does dovetail a little bit with what Mary said, which is you have a small group of people, stakeholders in the system, as well as like advocates in that system who really care about the data. They're the ones who are going to go into the dashboards and like really pick at it and really have questions. So to us, it's almost so you have to engage with them in a different way, in a more substantive way, like long-term relationship building than maybe you do with the rest of the community. Because with the rest of the community, what you're trying to do with the data is proof. Right? Like that is proof of what we're doing, et cetera, et cetera. But we know that those individuals aren't probably going to sit there and sift through it. The idea, at least from my perspective, is we're constantly out there, we're constantly talking about it. And even if nobody goes and clicks and actually looks at it, eventually it washes over people enough that they may go, well, that guy, that's the guy with all the data. That's, yeah, I trust that guy. And that's like, that is impactful. So I think having a strategy to not only talk to people and constantly be in people's ear, but to recognize that you may be talking to two different audiences and having different depths and different nuances in the conversations you're having, depending on which group you're talking to, whether it be a stakeholder in the system or the general public writ large.
Rachel, can I jump in and say one of the things we're trying to do? There are a number of smaller community entities, newspapers, we have Somali TV, we have Sahan Journal, we have all these various community ways of getting that information out there. And so I think it's really important to get our narratives out there in these various places where community members actually do get their information.
Absolutely. And I just want to follow up by mentioning that the IIP does a lot of work on strategic communications for prosecutors, and we're happy to be in touch. If you're interested in your office participating, reach out to us. But I think we'll have to end it there. I know there were more questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to them all, but this has been such an impactful and helpful conversation, I hope. And there's obviously an evolving area that we'll have to revisit many times. So I want to thank everyone for joining us and thank our esteemed panelists for this great conversation. We will be posting this whole webinar online in the next day or so. You can check out our website, prosecution.org, to see that link, and we'll also email it as well. Please sign up if you're not already on our listserv so that you don't miss any of our monthly webinars or other materials that we put out. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We hope you have a great rest of your day. And if you should have said it earlier, I hope you've all had a meaningful Juneteenth and that the lessons, as Allison said so well, continue to affect us all as we think about ways in which we can improve our offices. So thank you.